Fantastic. Oh, there we go, recording in progress. So my name is Tony Sigrist. I am the head of mental health and wellbeing delivery at ABC Life Support. I've been campaigning about mental health probably for about 12, 13 years now, since my former career, which was with the Metropolitan Police. I was a police officer for nearly 20 years and varied experience of mental health, but the majority of it coming from my own lived experience of struggling as a police officer, and then the voyage of discovery that occurred afterwards as a result of that, which has brought me into campaigning and now into education. And so if I can hand over to Josh and get him to introduce himself.
Thanks, Tony. Yes, like Tony said, it's great to see such big numbers here. And I think it does sort of highlight the value of the conversation and how much is needed. I work primarily today as a resilience coach. So I work with individuals and organizations around the world, trying to get them to look at resilience in what I would say is a new way, which is about coming back to ourselves, and rather than believing that we have to keep moving forward all of the time, no matter what, much more about understanding ourselves on a deep enough level, which is going to lend us quite nicely, I think, to what we're going to talk about today. And the reason that I do that work is a little bit like Tony, predominantly from my personal experience. So I sort of struggled a lot as a young boy and into my kind of young adulthood. I had struggles with addiction and a whole host of different mental health struggles, if you want to call them that, until my life kind of changed when I was around 24 years old. I've been 9.5 years sober now. So yeah, really looking forward to the conversation and tackling the subject of anger in a way that probably hasn't been, I don't see being done very often, and it's very needed. So looking forward to it.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Josh. So I think we've chatted quite a lot offline. One of the things I think we had a bit of synergy with is when I first entered this conversation, started talking about mental health, I found that I seemed to, by default, become a man's mental health champion. So I never set out to do that at all. I remember putting on some events and people saying, "Oh, it's great that you're doing men's mental health stuff." And I'm like, "Well, I'm not really. I'm just doing mental health." And it just seems to be that because I'm talking about it, and I am a man, I'm being seen as an expert around men's mental health. So when that started to happen, I was asked to do some work around it. I had to really sit around and think about what is it, what's different about men and women. And I suppose one of the places to start is, some of the cliches, some of the things that we say. And around this time, particularly when, some of the focus is shifting into men's health around November, one of the things I see quite a lot is it acceptable for men to cry? So this is something that gets bandied out, and a lot of people saying, of course it's okay for men to cry, it's fine for men to cry. And then I find myself dropping into that hole of thinking, well, is it really all right for men to cry? So Josh, what do you think?
Look, the first thing that I think of when you ask me, is it okay for men to cry? The first answer that comes into my mind is no, right? It's in most spaces, it feels like it's probably not okay for men to cry. Should it be okay for men to cry is a slightly different question, right? And I think the answer to should it be okay for men to cry, my answer would be yes, if they feel like they want to, right? What I sometimes feel like happens with this kind of conversation, and I think it's true that any conversation that has kind of lent too far one way for a long period of time does have a tendency to swing too far the other way. But I think that it's a big turnoff if we're not careful for men in this kind of pressure. Like, it's now seen like you have to be vulnerable and you have to be able to cry in front of other people. You see these things where it says like real men cry in front of other people, and you think, hang on a minute, are we not going too far this other way now and sort of pressurizing? Me personally, I don't feel safe to cry in front of other people. Not sure necessarily if I ever will. It has to be a very safe space for me to be able to do that. And the one thing that I would say, I recognize that is born out of the fact that it really isn't okay in our society for young boys to cry. And I think that's a real problem. And for me, I diverted all of my emotion to anger when I was a young boy, because it was more acceptable for me to be an angry young boy than it was for me to cry in front of my mates when I was a kid. And I need to cry a lot because I get overwhelmed easily. So I think for me, a lot of it comes back to boys. How do you feel? What do you think of when, if I put the same question to you?
Yeah. So I was a crier when I was a young lad. I'd cry if you looked at me the wrong way. Really, I was very emotional, very, very sensitive. Used to get told that I was too sensitive, which is interesting. That's probably a pathway we don't want to walk down, because what is too sensitive? But yeah, I would cry really, really easily, and I would just get slaughtered for it at school, particularly off the other boys. And it didn't feel comfortable, and it didn't feel safe. And when I say I was a crier actually till quite a bit later in life. And I think I just hit this point where I thought, I can't carry on crying like this. I can't be vulnerable like this. I need to stop, because it isn't acceptable. It didn't feel acceptable. I felt foolish and humiliated. And so I trained it largely out of myself. Now, I do still cry on occasions, but I never feel comfortable about it, ever. And in fact, a couple of months ago, I cried at a funeral, and I didn't know the person that well, and could hear the voice in my head going, get a hold of yourself, just get a grip, because you're here for someone else. You need to be stronger for them. So all of those superlatives coming into my own mind. But what I found is that training myself not to cry didn't stop me feeling emotional. It just left me needing a different way of expressing the same pain. And that's where my anger started to kick in, is that I felt that I'd had the tears knocked out of me, really, going into my 20s, but not the sensitivity that was still there.
And I think you've touched on what is a really important point when we're talking about anger here, right? Anger is a reaction to an emotion. And I think it's really important to understand that anger in and of itself isn't a bad reaction to an emotion either. I think it's important for us to say that some of the most important things in the history of our society, I believe, were driven by angry people. If you look at the suffragettes, for example, they were angry, right? And look at what they did with their anger. So anger in and of itself isn't a bad emotion. You mentioned that you were often told that you were too sensitive when you were younger. What I think people mean when they tell somebody that they're too sensitive is they can't handle how they feel when they sense your sensitivity, right? So it's impossible for you to be too sensitive. What's actually happened is they are struggling with the way it makes them feel when they sense your sensitivity. And so when sensitive young boys have their sensitivity suppressed because it's misunderstood, what you then have is a load of boys who are emotionally full, okay, and have never had anybody help them comprehend their experience when they're in those emotions. And so if I, like you, cry very easily when I get sad, right? If I'm then ridiculed when I cry as a young boy, well, then guess what? I will learn not to be sad, but I will learn to not show you my sadness. And then so I never learn how to comprehend who I am when I experience sadness. And there's a great book by a chap called Bessel van der Kolk, which is called The Body Keeps the Score. And that tells us that if we don't find a way to process and release our emotions, then our body will find a way to do it for us, because the emotion doesn't go away, right? If I keep my emotions in, that's not me controlling my emotions. It's my emotions controlling me. And I think that's really important. And it leads on to something that I think's, not talked about, which is when I'm struggling emotionally, I don't present in an attractive way. No. Okay. I'm not somebody you want to put your arm around, right? I'm somebody who is outwardly not very nice when I don't feel very nice internally. And I think that's true for a lot of men. And of course, we're generalizing. And what that meant is that I never really got help and support because I didn't resonate with somebody that was struggling emotionally. I thought I was an angry person who hated everybody. And that's very different to struggling emotionally, right? I don't know if what your experience was like with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you know, I mean, for me, it's just, you know, coming back to that question around, is it acceptable? Is it acceptable for men to cry? You know, I feel it's an easy statement to make. What does that mean? When I read that, what is that telling me? That might tell me that it's acceptable to that person, but actually it sounds like an instruction. It's like the other question that we said, is it okay to not be okay? And I know that there's been a lot of discussion around that about is it okay to not be okay? Actually, it's rubbish to not be okay. But also, I think if you interpret that language and say it's okay to be vulnerable, that's like have you been to Australia, Josh?
Not yet.
Okay, you've got to go. It's a good place. But that's like saying it's safe to swim. Right? You wouldn't say that in Australia unless you knew it was safe to swim, because lots of bitey things in the water, you know, and it might not be. To me, saying it's okay to cry, it's acceptable, that is a bit like saying it's safe to jump. But if you don't know where that person's jumping to, you don't know the environment that they're jumping into, that isn't a safe statement to make, because it might not be okay in that environment. It might not be okay to be vulnerable. And if you've had a bad experience of being vulnerable, of showing your vulnerability, I think that makes you even less likely to return and revisit that at a later stage. I think it compresses the problem.
Yeah, and I do think that's a really important part of the question, of the conversation, sorry, in terms of, like, you know, we do a lot of telling people to talk. We do a lot of telling people it's okay to be vulnerable. The reality is, and the truth is that if you've spent your life not feeling safe to be able to express your emotions, if you then for the first time express your emotions and become vulnerable in a place that doesn't feel safe, or that isn't safe, then actually you're going to take or you're likely to at least take a huge backward step. You know, I've talked recently about, they say that a problem shared is a problem halved, right? That's not the case if you share it with the wrong people or in the wrong space, right? And in fact, what that will actually do is trigger the same response that we had when we were younger, the very response that put us into that survival mode of, I best not express my emotions, right? And I think that becomes really, really important in the shame cycle that I certainly found myself in my life, right? Particularly when I look at myself as a parent, right? Myself as a dad. When I'm struggling emotionally, I tend to be much more short with my children, right? Now, I can struggle emotionally in terms of feeling overwhelmed when I'm in the supermarket, right? Or when I take my kids swimming and there's lots going on and I'm in this chaotic environment and I'm sensitive to sounds, right? So I feel very overwhelmed by them and I'm sensitive to light and everything's going on and I become more snappy with my children. Now, unless I know what that snappiness is a reaction to, well, then I'm just going to leave the swimming pool or the supermarket thinking I'm just not a very nice man. I'm not a very nice dad. Why can't I have fun with my kids at the swimming pool without getting short with them? And so I have to, you know, this conversation in those moments become really important, because them shame cycles that I used to send myself into are the shame cycles that I think a lot of men don't come back from. You know, they start feeling they can't express themselves emotionally. And so they lose a part of themselves. So they don't know who they are. So then they become, they're reacting with anger quite often because they're emotionally full. And so that spirals them further into that shame kind of spiral. And I think we lose a lot of men in that way. And that's why it's so important.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I hear a lot, men are closed books. Men don't talk about their emotion. Men don't express their emotion. You know, and I mean, first of all, there's lots of people who don't talk about their emotions. You know, and I just want to say as well on all of this, I think when we're talking about men, we're just talking about people, aren't we? Really, you know, we're talking about some of the popular narratives around men, but I think anything we're talking about applies to people across piece, really. Where was I going? I've lost my train slightly. But yeah, this idea that men aren't communicating their pain. I think angry people are communicating their pain. I don't think we understand it. I think it takes us to a different place. So we think about how our narrative around supporting someone who's crying, let it all out. Go on, let it all out. It's okay. Let it all out. Versus someone who's angry, you need to learn to control your anger. It shifts the focus, right, away from the supportive relationship into the, this is your stuff, you need to go and deal with that, and then come back when it's sorted. But the pain could be the same. I don't know what the answer is, really. You know, it feels like a tough landscape to navigate. What do you think?
Well, look, I think particularly when we're talking about children, right? I think I go so far as to say this, controversial perhaps, but the way in which we interact with children, we teach them to emotionally suppress on a large scale, right? So children are often told when they're feeling sad that there's people over the other side of the world that have it way worse than them. When they're feeling scared, they're told that there's nothing to be scared of. If they feel stressed or overwhelmed, they might hear an adult say to them, wait till you get in the big bad world. You don't know what stress or overwhelm is, yeah? And when they're angry, what happens to angry children in most scenarios is they are threatened, at least, or actually this is taken out. They are told that if they carry on behaving in that way, then they'll be removed from where they are at, right? And this happened consistently for me when I was a child. I was threatened with being removed from classrooms, or told, or actually removed from the classroom, right? And I'm not having to go at schools. I do lots of work with schools. I'm just talking about the ways in which we interact with children when they're in their emotions. What I believe that we need is more space, particularly for young people, to be able to comprehend who they are when they're in their experience. So if a child is angry, they don't need somebody, and this is true for adults as well, but I think it should start with children. But if somebody is angry, then what they need is somebody to help them comprehend where the anger's coming from, why it's happening, and possibly what the best thing to do with that motivation of anger is, right? Because sometimes we're angry for the right reasons. Sometimes we're angry because we're in a situation where somebody is crossing our boundaries. Now, when somebody crosses my boundaries, I don't know how to present my anger, which I'm not very good at, right? Because I was never taught. Then perhaps I'll hold it in, and then explode. And then there's consequences to my actions, right? However, if I learn that somebody's crossing my boundary, what I'm feeling right now is anger, and then I use that anger to help me to perhaps, I don't know, become assertive or to get across my point, right? Then I'm learning how to comprehend who I am when I'm in my experience, rather than just being this person who explodes all the time. Because I look at even my relationship, for example, with my wife, in the past, she's very good at communicating with me how she feels. Yeah, don't do that, Josh. It makes me feel uncomfortable. We can have a conversation and then we move forward. She does something that makes me feel uncomfortable. I don't really know how to convey that in a way that's acceptable. So I keep it to myself, and then I blow up when there's no milk in the fridge. Yeah. Right. Because I don't know how to communicate. Yeah. And so I think it is about comprehending our experiences in that space, Yeah.
I think there's something that I just I want to cover. There was another question that we'd said we'd address, on where the conversation on men's mental health might be missing the mark. And I think it responds a little bit to what you're saying as well. Is I just want to look at a little bit about some of the language we use and how I interpret that, and how we role model, how we role model men's mental health, how we present that. So the first thing I'd say, I don't think we covered it expressly, is when I repeatedly hear it's okay for men to cry, what my brain says is, well, it can't be, because if you're saying it's okay for men to cry, real men don't cry. Therefore, I don't want to cry. Does that make sense? I'm kind
Makes total sense,
yeah. You're reinforcing the stereotypes by trying to address the stereotypes. You reinforce them, and I think that as well plays into a very important issue for me around role models. So I don't think there's a rich enough variety of role models in the conversation of men's mental health specifically. because I think when we think about it, we try to find, what I see is attempts at fitting stereotypes around the messaging. So, for example, when a lot of people think, because I'm an ex-police officer, that my experience is trauma-based, to do with post-traumatic stress disorder, and it isn't. It doesn't happen to be based around that. But there's a lot of focus around that singular issue subject. So when I was a police officer, there was a lot of focus around post-traumatic stress disorder. They would sort of say, well, look, it's okay for men to experience poor mental health. Look at this person here. They experienced a really traumatic incident and they're talking openly about their experience. I see that and my brain says, wow, I need to be quiet because my experience is nothing compared to this person's experience. I don't think there's enough focus about just day-to-day stuff, about people struggling with managing their lives on a day-to-day basis. I think there's too much focus around trying to fit it around a male narrative that will appeal to men, and in doing so, enforcing that stereotype.
Yeah, I agree with you, and because I think what happens is we pathologize this, we over medicalize this, right, and we start to create these kind of categories to then ask, do you fit into this? Is it post-traumatic stress, right? Have you experienced this big trauma? And nobody actually remembers that we're all human beings, right? And we're all kind of moving through life in the best way that we know how. And on any given moment, I can be overwhelmed by any given experience, right? And that's why the kind of comparing of the external stuff in and of itself is problematic, right? It's problematic because if I compare the things that have happened to me to the things that have happened to you, and then try and line up how I feel about it and try and line it up with yours, then we're gonna kind of fall short every single time, right? Yeah. So just very quickly to kind of wrap up what I'm saying and bring it back to the question that you asked, where I think we fall short is that we focus on getting people to talk rather than trying to create spaces where there are lots of good listeners, right? I think that's the most important thing. In any given organization, we look at all these tips and tricks and how can you do this to do this, and we do all that stuff, and we need to create space for men and women and all genders really to be able to come in and feel like there's a safe space for them to feel like they can explore who they are. Right. Yeah. And we don't do that. We go, you need to talk, and actually create better listeners, create better spaces, and the talkers will follow.
Absolutely. Absolutely couldn't have put it better myself, Josh. I think that's beautifully put. Absolutely.
Brilliant.
Danielle, you're going to take that as an end point, aren't you? You're on mute.
Yeah, we're there, yeah. Danielle. Let's do it.
That time has gone so quickly, seriously. And again, touching on some of the stuff you've talked about, there is so much more. There's so many more levels that you could have gone down, gone through if we were not short on time. We're trying to keep this a bite size so you can watch this in your lunch break. But I've had some fantastic questions come through. This is also quite interesting. The questions are coming through from women. That's all I'm going to say in terms of picking up on who's asking them. But I found that to be quite interesting, just as a kind of by the by. But first question is, violence is often misinterpreted as anger. How can we help change the narrative?
Yeah.
Should we go? Yeah, go for it.
Well, it's a really good point, and I was thinking this as we were talking, and right up when we talked about this, there was a bit of discomfort around talking about anger, because when you talk about anger, you think of violence, and not the same things. Anger and violence are very distinct things. I'm quite angry, but I'm not violent. It's a similar thing when we deliver mental health first aid. We talk about psychosis and those associations we make with psychosis and violence, which are also inaccurate. The majority of people who experience psychosis won't be violent, but we assume that they are because all we've been fed is media messages of psychosis and violence, how it's portrayed in popular media. You know, I think that the first step in addressing any narrative is to talk about it and talk about it accurately. So, you know, starting to redress that will help to change things. But I don't think it'll be quick.
No, thank you, Tony. What about you, Josh?
Yeah, no, look, I think it's about conversation, right? It's about having dialect, and it's about opening the conversation up to people. I do think it's massively always misunderstood. People think that anger is violence or rage out, you know, lashing out in that way. So I think it's important to understand that the anger is valuable, actually, when we learn about it in a proper way, right? And like I've said, and I'll say it again, some of the best things that have happened in the history of our society have been driven by angry people. So we best get better at understanding it
And processing it. Thank you. Awesome. Another question then. Why do men, and this one's for you, Josh, why do men tend to take themselves away from their loved ones, which is a supportive environment that includes maybe a partner and children, when they are feeling angry, depressed, and in a pressure cooker, not communicating how they feel?
Think about when a man who's struggling with their emotions may have struggled with their emotions when they were a child, and what may have happened from their loved ones when they were a child, right? So if a young boy, particularly going back some years now, if a young boy got upset, visibly upset or visibly emotional in front of his family, well, then he might have been shamed for it, or likely would have been shamed for it. Young boys will be shamed by their friends when they show their emotions. And so they learn that when they show their emotions, that they're a hindrance, that they're a problem, and then they don't feel safe, and they've never learned how to express them in front of anybody. So their natural survival mechanism is to go away and to be on their own. Yeah. I can still be like it now. It's so difficult. I can convey my emotions like this on a public scale way easier than I can to someone that I'm seeking attachment from, right? Because I'm terrified that if I show them that emotion, the shame that I feel very physically in my body is really tangible. So it's really important to understand it's a safety mechanism and it's a survival mechanism. And the importance of understanding that is that if we push back against that too much, then what we're going to find is that the shame becomes even more frightening and it will further compound. So that's, you know, the simple answer. Of course, it is a complex question of which there are many answers, but that's the main answer I would give.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Makes total sense as well. I think a lot of the stuff in the mental health space as well comes from our deep-rooted experiences, which are often not kind of thought about too much, you know, because I hear people go, oh, we've all got past, or we've all got history, you know, it doesn't mean I behave in a certain way, but we don't understand people's frames of reference, every single person with their own experience, you know. Another question that's come through, do you have any advice for middle managers who support men in the workplace to cope with stress-related anger? Tony, do you want that one?
Yeah.
So any advice for middle managers?
Help them alleviate stress. Less stress equals less anger. So look, so it's a really good question. That, you know, anger as an expression of stress indicates that someone's stress is bubbling over, that the stress is too much, and the anger is the expression of the stress. So we always go to the symptom. You know, I mean, our medical system is, you know, is built around symptomatic treatment, treating symptoms, not causes. But if the cause is the stress, then it's the stress that needs managing. And managing stress isn't necessarily about managing stress out, because a bit of stress is good, gives you a little bit of an edge. But if it's too much, it needs to be released. And I think what's really important for middle managers to understand is that everybody's capacity for stress is not the same. So you can't compare person A with person B, because life experience will dictate how much stress you can cope with before it starts boiling over, quite simply. So I think there's a huge piece of work around line management to understand the stress model and how stress looks for individual people, and around promoting stress release and stress management.
Fantastic. Excellent. Okay, another one. Do you have, that's it, any advice, this is for you, Josh, any advice on exploring and identifying diverse role models for men's mental health?
Look, it's not an easy question to answer, because I think it feeds in a little bit to what Tony was saying earlier, right? We have this tendency to just wheel out somebody who looks very quote unquote masculine, right? Who's willing to kind of talk about his emotions, right? I'm not silly enough either to kind of know that I'm not leaning into that to a certain degree in the work that I do, right? But I think the best thing that we can do is we need to create more space to invite men to feel confident to come forward and be able to express what's going on, right? I think the more that we can create that space, because my experience is not that men don't talk, right? My experience is that you create the right space, you won't shut them up, right? I mean, like when I speak at any public event and get vulnerable, yeah, Tony's one of them, right? Yeah. But when I speak, there's a queue of men afterwards that want to talk about their feelings and their emotions. So it's false that men don't talk about their emotions. It's not true. But what is true is that we lack that space for men to be able to do that and to feel comfortable and confident and safe to do that. And so that's where the work is for me, is in creating them spaces. What do those spaces look like? And again, we cannot polarize too much with that. You know, men do a little bit of this laddie, arm punching, bantery. There's a bit of that goes on. That's what makes some men feel safe. If you start saying that you can't do that, all right, then you're going to take away spaces that work for some men, and it is different for everybody. And that's the importance of it. So the more, you know, I hate to keep bringing it back to space, but I do think it's so important.
Can I answer that as well, Danielle? Because I'm itching to answer that, to be honest. So I like really great observations, Josh. But look, I had a chat with a reporter a little while ago about potentially running a news piece, and I got a really interesting lesson around what makes something newsworthy. And what makes things newsworthy is the story. And the problem, I think, with a lot of messaging and role modeling is that it has to be a bit dramatic or sexy, you know. And so for me, I said the other day, a lot of the people I've heard speak out, a lot of personal experience stories I've heard in the last 5 years are more likely to make me shut up and speak up, to be quite honest, because of that whole, it becomes unrelatable. So, you know, my examples of some of the celebrities that I've seen, but some of the ex-soldiers, when they talk about their experiences of PTSD, I think, I'm not surprised. You know, I can understand that. I can rationalize what's going on there. But that doesn't make me want to speak up, because I don't want to share that space and talk about struggling with the bills and struggling with, you know, bullying from my childhood and stuff like that. It doesn't feel sexy, doesn't feel safe to talk about. So I think if we want to create richness and diversity in role models, we have to be prepared to listen and maybe sacrifice the fact that it isn't all going to be a great story. You know, it's not all about a great story, or it's not always about winning either. You know, I often said, I'll tell my story when I've beaten my demons, and then I caught myself a few years ago and I'm like, yeah, I just need to tell my story because it's ongoing. You know, I think it's really important that all of the messaging isn't always about winning or sexy or dramatic. You know, it's just got to be real, and then people will relate to it.
Yeah, and let me add to that very quickly, because I think the hero story is one we have to be careful that we don't get obsessed with in this space, because we are obsessed with it, right? And I get wheeled out sometimes as someone who's overcome all of his problems so you can overcome yours. And I think, trust me, on any given day, I can wake up in exactly the same state as I was 10 years ago when I stopped drinking. So let's not make this about somebody's overcome something. And it's easy to lean into that, by the way, because, you know, I could do that story and 75% of the people in there that are watching will be motivated and be like, wow, you know, I feel inspired. But the 15% who actually need support will be like I would have been back in the day when I was really in a dark space, which is I would have sat there and gone, that's okay for you, but I'm not like that. That won't work for me. Yeah, exactly. You know, and I think it's really important that we go careful with that hero story.
That's fantastic. Really valid points there. In terms of another question, It's not a question, actually. It's kind of something to add. One of the listeners has said, I agree with the understanding anger. My son was also always thrown out of class and eventually school because of small thing, because of the way it was interpreted, escalated into something bigger due to the way it was handled. And I know, Josh, you were talking about school. I have a son myself, 13, he's at that age. And it's hard to try and talk to them about something which is so socially unacceptable, even though we know that, and you've said it a few times today, Josh, that it is a very important emotion to have. But it seems that the way in which sometimes those that have not quite understood or learnt yet how to process that emotion comes out, and they're punished over and over again for it. And this is where it starts. So we are talking today, Tears of an Angry Man. What about tears of angry boys, and what to do about those tears, and to educate everybody involved in this so that we can have young boys and girls, and and every gender, to grow up to know that it's okay to not be okay, actually, and this is what it might look like. And Tony and I have always discussed in the office often, you said at the beginning of today's session, it's okay not to be okay, and then in brackets, as long as it's quiet and attractive and socially acceptable, So there's that double narrative there.
Yeah, look, one of the things I just want to touch on this. One of the problems that we have in school, if you look at the statistics, by the way, they will correlate. The ways that schools are grossly underfunded, by the way, and the ways that we focus only on the academic stuff, right? I go into school, I go into a corporate environment and do self-care training, right? Put yourself first. You are of value. You're lovable who you are. You're allowed all of your emotions. What do we teach kids at school, generally speaking? Unless you try really, really hard, you ain't going to be nobody in this environment, right? That's what we teach. We've got children within our society, the 5th richest democracy in the world, by the way. 1 in 3 children are living in relative poverty, right? So actually, we have to get really real about this and say we need to come back to funding children properly, right? We need to come back to looking at creating space. Children have just had 18 months completely removed from their life, and the education secretary at the time first thought was, let's introduce Latin. So we talk about mental health training in school. I'll tell you what, mental health training in school will be completely redundant if it's delivered by a teacher who is on the brink of stress and burnout.
Yeah.
So we need to create space in schools, and we live in a society now where community is shrinking, right? If your mum or dad can't be emotionally available for you, then there's a good chance there won't be any adults emotionally available for you, because it won't be a teacher, because their hands are tied, by the way, by the academic pressure in which they're put under, right? So many teachers leave that profession because they don't get to do what they went in it to do, which is support children. So we need to really, really look at that. We need to, because I'll tell you what'll happen. We've got 1 in 3 children living in poverty. And in 10 years' time, we'll be going, why are the crime levels what they are, right? Where's this coming from? Let's spend loads of money on more prisons, right? And everyone will be scratching their head. And no one will look at the fact that 1 in 3 children grow up in poverty. Of course, there's going to be more crime, right?
And that's what makes me angry.
Yeah, exactly. That's what makes me angry. I won't. I'll put my soapbox away, otherwise I'll be off on one. But I do think, until we come back and support our children properly and create space for our children, right? We will have children. We will have angry children running around dressed as adults, disguised as adults, because that's what we got, right? Because I was one of them, still am to a degree.
Thank you, Josh.
Soapbox is the way.
Oh no, that's great. We do love a soapbox. It's past, and we are very conscious of your time. So thank you so much for those of you that are here. I've got lots of different comments coming in here. So first of all, just to say thank you so much, Josh and Tony, for speaking so openly and passionately about a different topic. I have somebody asking what the next steps are that they can practically take. I think actually, while I'm getting these ready, Josh, can you just tell people about what it is that you do? Tony, you can tell people about what it is that we do, and hopefully that crossover in terms of education pieces and signposting perhaps can come up at that point. And while you're doing that, please keep it about 30 seconds, and then I will get to the other questions and let people go after. So I'll just scroll down. But yeah, go.
Josh, do you want to go first?
Want to go first, Tony? Go on.
Go on. Okay, yeah. So ABC Life Support deliver various mental health awareness training, mental health first aid. We're licensed providers of mental health first aid, England's full suite of mental health training, but we do our bespoke training as well, and do speaking and events, strategic work, so we can work with your organisation to take a whole organisational approach to shifting the culture of mental health and well-being, which is really important. Training alone is not enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, brilliant. Look, I work with a lot of different organizations to create human experiences for people to explore themselves on a bit of a deeper level. I talked a lot about space today, and I think space is really, really important. So a lot of the work that I do isn't too over-engineered and is about creating spaces that help cultivate self-exploration. So that's me. That's the work I do. I do that in the corporate environment, and I always make sure that at least twice a month I'm going into a school as well to work with young people, just to, you know, for all the reasons that I've just given you.
Awesome, thank you. So we've just got a few more comments, then we let you guys go. So agree, I got so angry with myself and also had a lot to say on our shared experiences. You're so right there, Josh. My 14-year-old is going through exactly what you described regarding the missing 18 months and how it's affected him. Right too, that the academic situation doesn't regard this. Someone else says, I absolutely agree with the last point. Schools need to be given funds for those with the appropriate training and experience to deliver mental health. There also seems to be a cancel culture creeping into schools too. So if a child has an opinion, and it's very worrying, dismissing a child's opinion is particularly harmful and toxic. Being heard is so important. Thank you so much. This has been a great session. And yes, as a couple of people asking how they can access this recording, it will be made available. And after we have worked our editing magic, and when I say our, I totally don't mean myself, our magic, we will get that made available to people that sign up to our mailing list. So I'll be sending out some information after for both Josh's platform and our own. Please do feel free to sign up to any of those, if not both, and you'll be able to access whatever content it is that we put out there available afterwards. And somebody else said, thank you so much, brilliantly discussed and spot on examples. Brilliant, much needed session. So I think that's it. But guys, thank you so much for attending today. I think it's a really important conversation to be had. And as the Chief Exec of ABC Life Support, I think it's important that we continue to have really vital and impacting conversations around the subject of health, full stop, but specifically around mental health. So thank you all so much for attending today. It's been a pleasure, and thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Right, if you're still in the room, please feel free to just leave if you wish, but I'll be stopping the recording now.